It just seems like Iran's out of reach for Israel. And in a couple of years, these integrated defenses from Russia and China are fully established,
Hmm.
then it's done. And then if then what will Israel do? Can it be like, okay, do they? It just feels like they have this
Yeah,
one track mind, and they're going to just keep on doing this, even though it's over. It just feel like I just want to
yeah,
shake them, be like,
yeah,
guys, it's done. You can't do this. Just stop, But they
right.
they won't.
Yeah. No, no, it's true. I mean, there's just no the Israeli mentality is, total defeat of the enemy. It's just like they will feel like they haven't achieved their objective until, the whole Middle East is in ruins and they alone stand. I don't think that's really much of an exaggeration. Again, I mentioned Jabotinsky and the Iron Wall, the Wall of Iron. You see that kind of language. It's always been a part of the Zionist mentality, and it's actually rather than it has grown. It has become like the only mentality. Whereas before there were people, going back a few decades anyway, that did look at actually took negotiations. I mean, people within Israel that thought, maybe we really can make deals and we can learn to live with these people. Um, there was that point of view. I think maybe it was always a minority point of view, but it's just about gone now, and it's just the wall of iron. Like recently, this you mentioned the Black Flag operation against Yemen. It was the Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz, that said, like, whoever raises a hand against us, will cut off that hand. It's
Mm.
just there's no resistance. Everybody, all there just has to be abject defeat. Just total subjugation of all these all neighboring countries, all countries within the region. And clearly, Iran is still standing, and now Iran is angry. Iran is proud. Um, I think maybe the more important, it's going to take a while to really build up the air defenses. Maybe the more important question is their retaliatory capability. How to what extent did Israel succeed in destroying their launch facilities and their mobile launchers? Towards the end, we were seeing, there was, we would see maybe 20 missiles at a time. Now, many people theorize that was actually a deliberate choice. They're in there for the long haul, and they figure they just keep on sending out 20 at a time. And maybe that's true. That's what the Iranians were doing. But another possibility is that their launch capabilities had been seriously degraded by by the Israelis. Especially by Operation Rising Lion in the first couple of days there, the first day in particular. We just don't know. But if they can rebuild that retaliatory capability, and I am not a military engineer, but I'm just guessing that that's something they can do faster. If they have the missiles, and it seems like everybody agrees that they still have a lot of missiles, they really didn't dent that. We can't know that for a fact, but that just seems to be the general consensus from Israel in the West, and from the Iranians too. If they can just rebuild that launch capability, if in fact it was seriously degraded, then even if their air defense is still weak, like maybe it still will be very weak for 2 months from now, and Israel launches an attack, well, they can start retaliating and really make Israel pay the costs. And again, Israel will fail. And if they even suffer even more greatly this time, it will really penetrate the Israeli psyche too.
I feel like it's already has to be penetrated already.
Yeah,
Israeli
it's
psyche.
well, maybe they're in a state of denial. It's just funny. Maybe it's also just plain out censorship. They're just if they
Yeah.
receive guidelines, be positive about this. We did
Right.
wonderful.
Well,
They
just
didn't
their
damage us.
right,
Right.
and I think they have their Hasbro machines. Their
Yeah.
propaganda organs
Right.
are
But yeah,
going.
even editorial policies. There's Haaretz will obviously you know go against the government in a very significant way when it comes, sometimes anyway, to the treatment of the Palestinians. But I don't see any sign of that on Iran, and I think maybe they may have been just instructed. This happens in the U.S. too with mainstream papers. This is their policy, stick with it.
Mhm.
And because I am struck by the absence of any real serious reflection about what happened to them during that 12-day war.
Yeah. So at this Operation Black Flag, it feels like Israel might be lashing out a bit because they didn't succeed with Iran. I mean, it was during Iran, the war, 12-day war with Iran, that we started getting these daily massacres at the food aid distribution points. Just horrific, people lining up for food, and then they just start getting shot, or tank shells being shot into the crowds. And then we saw an increased amount of bombing in Lebanon. I've been seeing that's starting back up again. We had that Christian village in the West Bank that was burned to the ground, Taipei.
Yeah, it wasn't actually burned to the ground, but yeah, I mean, houses
attacked,
were burned.
I guess. Yeah, houses.
Right. But other villages have been burned to the ground. I mean, it's the violence in the West Bank is, is quite severe and continues, and the rate of ethnic cleansing there has clearly accelerated. Again, like I've said many times, if we didn't have all these other disasters, many of them Israeli caused, we'd probably all be talking about the West Bank and the suffering of the people there. But we don't even mention it because it's just so much worse in other places, like Gaza.
Right. So basically, instead of trying to wind down, Israel's ramping up around the area that it can control. Let's go back to bombing Gaza, go back to bombing Lebanon, terrorizing people in the West Bank, and they're doing this Operation Black Flag against the Houthis. Oh, it sounds like I don't know exactly what's happening, but I'm hearing that they're having some trouble flying over Yemeni airspace. That the Houthis do seem to have some air defense systems that's sort of keeping them from just flying directly over.
Right.
So do you think that this is their strategy, that they, instead of winding down, they're just going to ramp up around the region, continue to do more and more damage to anger people, to maybe try to elicit some type of response from somebody else to give them a justification to try to manufacture consent for this war?
Well, I think it's Netanyahu sees a great advantage, as we said many times, sees a great advantage in being a war president, and that's one reason he wants to continue the war. But I don't think it's just about career; it's his ideological bent. Going back to Jabotinsky, who was actually Jabotinsky's, I believe, his deputy. He was the leader of a right-wing Zionist movement, but I believe his deputy was in fact Netanyahu's father. I mean, it's just that this is part of his thinking. It's just that, the only solution is a military solution. It is total conquest. It has to be just the Arabs have to, all of them, recognize that they are a defeated people. They have to bow their heads and never raise them again. I mean, that's the thinking, and I think that's explains a lot of what's going on. And certainly Netanyahu is supported in that by, especially by his right-wing coalition allies, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. But there really isn't, there's some opposition in the larger Israeli society, but not much. It's more about like the pace of the attacks and maybe putting the short-term emphasis on getting the hostages home. So that's one reason, we're hearing a lot about a possible ceasefire. Hamas actually, one was offered, Hamas agreed to it, but my understanding is that they actually asked that, first of all, that the IDF, withdraw from at least almost all of Gaza. And then second, that the ceasefire essentially be permanent, or that like a mechanism would be set up to make sure that the Israelis don't don't renew the war, as soon as they get their 10 hostages. But the Israelis rejected that. So, that's where the debate is within Israeli society. I think there is a majority of people who want to see a ceasefire and want to see the hostages home. But in the long run, there is a consensus that, we must, establish that wall of iron. We must just utterly defeat the Arabs to the extent, again, where they really don't regard the Arabs as fully human. And I'm afraid to say that really applies to the great majority of Jewish Israeli society. Another poll came out, this one actually conducted, I think, by an Israeli university, that showed that, again, 82% of Jewish Israelis think that there is no such thing as an innocent Gazan. So even the children are guilty. Again, that actually just corroborates what um, that I guess it was a University of Pennsylvania uh, poll found. Slightly different language, but the same thing. Essentially, yeah, we can we have a right. We should cleanse all of Gaza, and even we have a right to kill them. I mean that's what that suggests. If that nobody is innocent, including the children, there are no innocents in Gaza. I can't hear you.
Sorry, I had myself muted. I said, yeah, that's just crazy. Um, I feel like one thing that is, I mean, it's keeping the peace between Iran, maybe, and Israel, is just that the United States, that there is no support for this war, for the U.S. to be involved in a war with Iran. But I know I think the goal then is, as long as that's the case, I feel a little bit safe. But I know that we are very good at manufacturing consent. I think you're reading a
Yeah.
book right now about manufacturing consent.
Okay. Well, no, no.
So,
Okay. The book Manufacturing Consent is a famous book and well worth reading by Noam Chomsky, and there's also another co-author. His name escapes me right now. That appeared back in the 1980s, and yeah, manufacturing consent is actually just like kind of right, getting consent from the public to carry out these operations that the political elite want to carry out. Um, but what I'm reading now is Manufactured Crisis.
oh,
Yeah, by Gareth Porter, which is about the Iran nuclear program, and as the title suggests, really the lies that have been created, the slander that has been directed against Iran over the years. And it's a fascinating book. I mean, the history is quite extraordinary. I've already drawn from it, and I'll continue to draw from that.
okay. Okay. Well, yeah. So not that book, The Manufactured Crisis, but just manufacturing the consent. I think this is what we have to be wary of, that this is the goal, that there's going to be a lot of work on, like, how do we sell this war to the American people? Do you know how we might go about doing that? Or how Israel will go about doing that? Like, what should we
Yeah.
watch out
Well,
for?
obviously, like what um, the propaganda line so far has all been about the Iranian nuclear program. It's the Iranian nuclear scare. They'll get the bomb and, they'll drop it on New York or something like that. Some sort of suggestion of that, or at least on Tel Aviv. So that's been the approach, and they'll probably try it again. I'm struck by actually how it, obviously works with some people, but in general, it didn't work very well. It sounded too much like the Iraq War and the WMD pretext. So there really wasn't support for our intervention. Now, when this bombing run was carried out, and it was successful to all appearances, at least superficially, there was on the Republican side there was support. It was better than 80% of Republicans actually supported what he did. But that's just a one-off mission, and overall it was pretty much evenly split, and maybe even negative, which is really amazing, because typically, like I've said before, when our boys go out and bomb someplace, everybody collapses. So it already shows that there's resistance, there's skepticism. It's going to be tough. I think it also shows that if you can limit your missions to something like, a single bombing run, you can get away with it, and maybe even, get support from your base. And I think that's probably the lesson that Trump took from this. But if it goes, if it's long term, I think that support will drain away very quickly, even from his base. Or if it leads to blockage of the Strait of Hormuz, and apparently the Iranians took the first steps to do that during this 12-day war, and that's something that greatly alarmed Trump. That's why he had his drill baby drill, um, Truth Social post. I think he was thinking, oh my God, what's going to happen? Those are real fears, and legitimate fears. If we become involved in any significant way, even if in a minor way, we don't. Iran has some cards to play, and they could really, really hurt us. So, yeah, it's going to be. These guys are crazy. They'll just go after it. In some ways, they don't even care. It seems like, if they do lose the propaganda war. They just may do it. They can win it within, as long as they can convince other elites, the decision makers, including Donald Trump, to do it. It'll happen, even if they, but it will, if it does happen, it just won't have the kind of support, popular backing that past military ventures have. So it could, especially if it goes south, it could have real negative repercussions for the administration, but, just for the U.S. government long term.
Yeah, something that I'm afraid about is potential Israeli attacks on the United States as a false flag. I don't know if this is just me being paranoid, but just seeing the way that Israel operates, like what they did with Iran, is just how deeply they penetrated Iranian society. They had all these sleeper cells operating within Iran that they activated for the sneak attack. We saw something similar in Hezbollah. We saw the penetration of the pagers that they used with Hezbollah. We saw something similar in Syria as well, how they were able to bribe government officials and threaten people. They're very involved. So they have all their agents in all these countries. And think about the United States. I'm sure I mean, we have an open border basically, right? So anybody that they do want to put in, if they do want to throw in some type of, ISIS, Mossad agents type of people into this country that they can. And, they'll find some disgruntled Iranians and try to do what they can to trigger something and then blame Iran for this. Like Iran's doing it, because that is a lot of the rhetoric that we have is like, there's these plots. Iran is trying to assassinate Donald Trump, and we got to watch out for sleeper cells, Iranian sleeper cells in America. And the reality is, like, I'm worried about Israeli agents, or associated operatives here that will try to do something to frame it as an Iranian. Because just the fact that they're telling people, watch out for Iranian sleeper cells, they're out there. Everybody look out for these Iranians
Right.
in America.
Well, yeah, it's certainly not impossible. Again, as I pointed out before, Israel has a history of using false flags, some major ones, again, like the Lavon affair, USS Liberty. But, and yeah, it is conceivable. I think I mean, the idea that the Iranians would actually try to assassinate a US president, for example, this is so obviously not in their interest. You can see how cautious Iran is in dealing with the U.S. They do not want to give the Americans any pretext, so why would they do this? This would just be like signing their own death warrant. But the Israelis do have an incentive to make it appear that the Iranians attempted to assassinate or did assassinate a U.S. leader. So yeah, it's possible. I mean, it's certainly possible. And if Yeah, especially if it may not be necessary. They again, you talk about because Israel has so many actually, public legal assets within the U.S. that they usually get their way. But occasionally, like we see with Trump, I think he's unpredictable. He might, especially since he staked his reputation on the success of the B-2 bomber operation. What was that operation called now?
Midnight Hammer.
Midnight Hammer, right. The success of Midnight Hammer. He may be reluctant to say that we need to go in again. He would consider it sort of like an affront to his own dignity and his own sense of importance. It would be a suggestion that his mission was not the most incredible and successful of all time. So he might fight it, for example, even though the people around him are pushing him to launch another strike. And so if it becomes clear that, okay, we can't get him on board, we really need to get the Americans involved in this, yeah, they could. I mean, I'm not predicting that it will happen. It's a very risky move on their part. It could be exposed, but you have such a compliant media that even if like it happens and then all of a sudden all kinds of questions are raised about, hey, this doesn't seem quite right. It'll be papered over, all the usual suspects are going to be shouting at the top of their lungs, they tried to kill our president or whatever. And, enough is enough. We just got to go in and solve this problem once for all. And it'll be those other questions will barely be heard. It's just like, well, wait a second, this conspiracy that you call it, or this attempted assassination, just doesn't add up. That'll be the soft voice. The loud voice is we have to attack. So, it could happen.
Mm. Well, Netanyahu's in DC right now. It just, it's so sickening that he's here, that this guy that's engaged in a genocide. I don't like to do World War II comparisons because everyone does it, but it just feels like it's like inviting Hitler over and celebrating him. And I feel like that's what history is going to look at when we look back on this, is that we were, all these standing ovations we're giving to this genocidal war criminal, inviting him over to our country. It's just, how are we going to live that down in
Yeah,
the future?
no, I agree. I mean, that was the thought that crossed my mind when the last time he addressed the Congress and he got all those standing ovations. Is that, we'll probably looking at. I guess we don't talk about reels anymore. We used to, like when I was young, I saw reels from the Nuremberg rallies and that kind of thing. Um, but yeah, there will be footage of his congressional addresses. That'll be provided in future documentaries. I think that's quite likely. And people would say, how could that have happened? How could that have happened?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, history is written by the victors, but you can't, I feel, but I don't know who the victor is going to be
Yeah.
here. I just feel
Well, that's
like,
the scary thing. It's just, nothing the good guys don't always win. But it just seems that to me, as for the reasons that we've laid out time and again, and I think in increasing and more convincing detail, that we are headed on, this empire, this hegemonic world order, and Zionism too, are going to fail. They're on a self-destructive course. It's just a question of time. Will that documentary come out 50 years from now or 10 years from now? I don't know.
yeah. Yeah. Well, maybe you should write that history, Dad. I think so. This is such a fascinating history, and it's so important, and it's important that we get this right in the
Uh-huh.
future. So when we look back on it, um, yeah, you can write it and yeah, do the audio book for it, and then just help everybody go to sleep at night with your voice. Just be doing the world a service.